Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Lieberman, Food and Beverage Practice Leader at FOA & Son Insurance Brokers. And thank you so much for joining us today for episode 4 of Food for Thought. Transparency in the food supply chain. Customers want it and customers deserve it. What does transparency mean? Today, I want to challenge you to think about food and beverage supply chain transparency differently. To help push you along with that challenge, I am joined here today by John Keogh. John is a true thought leader on this topic. He's a thought leader on supply chain, or as he puts it, ecosystems, and how to create transparency and resiliency in that food ecosystem. John, thank you so much for joining us today. It is such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Michael, and the pleasure is all mine.
So I did mention resiliency. John, I follow all of your teachings, and you really just pushed me to think about all of this differently. And, not just transparency, but resiliency of supply chains. It is so vital at this time because the food and beverage supply chain has been tested by COVID-19 and all of the complications that this pandemic has brought to the supply chain. It's tested supply chains. It has broken the systems that make up these ecosystems, as you teach about so often. So I think this conversation is very timely. So I appreciate you being here with us today. Just some housekeeping notes for everyone who is listening. John and we pre-recorded our discussion just the other day. We actually had a 2-hour conversation that through the magic of editing, we have distilled that down to about 30 minutes. So we are going to get to that pre-recorded discussion here shortly. If you have questions, please use the Q&A tool on Zoom to enter your questions. We are also streaming this on Facebook Live. I believe we're also streaming this on YouTube. We are going to be monitoring questions that come through those avenues as well. Patty Devine, she is here with us today. She is going to moderate the Q&A session after our live discussion. So hi, Patty. Say hello to everyone for us.
Hi, Michael. Hello. Good to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. Hey, Patty, thank you. As always, thank you for everything that you do to bring this production to life. You put a lot of work into it, and it's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yes, please stay tuned after our pre-recorded discussion. John and we're going to come back to field those questions live for you here. So stay tuned for that. Another reason to stay tuned is that we have a very special message that you will hear from No Evil Foods. You're going to hear that message during the pre-recorded discussion, but then during our live Q&A, we are going to select 2 random listeners to actually receive some No Evil Foods product. So please stay tuned for that. No Evil Foods is an amazing vegan food company, really putting out amazing assortment of products. Please check them out. But for now, housekeeping notes are over. I encourage you to sit back, relax, and enjoy episode 4 of Food for Thought. Consumers today demand and they deserve to know more about the products that they consume. However, complexity in the food supply chain or ecosystem creates multiple avenues for systems failure. How can food and beverage companies utilize technology, regulations, and industry standards to enhance supply chain transparency? I'm Michael Lieberman, Food and Beverage Practice Leader at FOA & Son Insurance Brokers, and this is Food for Thought. It has become a tradition here on Food for Thought to surprise our guest speaker with a gift. Today's guest, John Keogh, shared with us that he is a vegan. So we gave our friends at No Evil Foods a call to see if they could send John some of their amazing vegan products. When John got wind of what we were up to, he graciously suggested that we donate product to a local food bank. On the heels of a year that has caused so many people pain and sadness, we thought this was a great way to start our first episode of Food for Thought in 2021. Later on, we will hear from No Evil Foods about some of the work that they are doing within their local community. FOA & Son will be making a donation to help No Evil Foods continue in the positive work that they are doing. Thank you to John, and thank you to No Evil Foods. Today's guest on Food for Thought is John Keogh. Mr. Keogh is a strategist, C-level advisor, and academic researcher with 30 plus years of executive leadership roles as director, Vice President and Senior Vice President in Global Supply Chain Management, Information Technology, Technology Consulting, and Global Supply Chain Standards. He advises the public and private sectors worldwide and is a regular subject matter expert on TV and radio. Mr. Keogh is managing principal at Toronto-based niche advisory and research firm Shantala Inc. With a passion for simplifying complexity and reducing information asymmetry in food supply chains, his advisory and research focus is primarily on how technologies can combine with industry standards and analytical science to enhance transparency and trust and meet regulatory requirements. John, welcome to Food for Thought. John, thank you so much for joining me here on Food for Thought. Very much appreciated. I know you're a very busy man these days. I have been following your work for quite some time. I am really very honored to have you here. And today I'm really excited to take a deep dive into that food and beverage ecosystem to get your thoughts on transparency or perhaps lack thereof in some cases, and what food and beverage executives may want to do or may want to consider when they're thinking about transparency within their own ecosystems. Now, as an insurance broker, I have specialized in the food and beverage industry for the past 20 years. Transparency in the supply chain has always been on my radar. And you shared a slide that I thought did a really nice job of illustrating the complexity of the food supply chain. And I would just love if you could, if you have that slide handy, if you could kind of put that up on the screen and walk us through that slide, bringing the listeners today through that food supply chain.
So in this, I've been using this slide for more than a dozen years. So what I typically do is bring people to their dinner plate, and on the right-hand side you can see there's some fish. It could be salmon, could be something else. There's things that look like eggs, but they're actually potatoes, and you have some veggies. And coming out of that, if you look at the yellow line, that represents a macro level of a supply chain with potatoes. So you can see we buy them in the mall or retail. The mall would have bought them from a wholesaler who get them from a packing house, and they get them from multiple farms. Now, herein lies the first part of the complexity. When farms or multiple farms in different regions, or they could even be within the same region, they supply into a packing house will commingle. So we already lose traceability at that point, unless they have really good batch control, that they're saying that in this batch of potatoes, we have potatoes only from 2 or 3 different farms that are very close to each other. So some companies are really, really good at doing that, so that if there is an issue or a recall later, they'll be able to say, okay, so these batches are involved, they came from these farms. This is a very, very simple view of the supply chain. If you look at all the ingredients that come into the farm, you have fertilizer, you have insecticides, herbicides, pesticides, and many, many other things. Well, I've worked with the World Customs Organization and Interpol in the past because, believe it or not, there's also a lot of fake fertilizer on the market. There's also fake insecticide, herbicide, pesticides, you name it. So anything that we can produce and put into our ground to help plants grow, our fruit, the bad guys are out there. We have, what I often say is that we have 2 issues with trust in the food chain. And one is bad character and the other one is bad data. We can fix bad data if we start using standards like GS1 standards, for example, and we have interoperability between different platforms, but bad character we can never fix. We have to watch out for it and look for it. But when you start to build this picture, you realize very quickly that software alone, or even humans, can't tell you if that's really salmon because it looks like trout. And in fact, in China, there's no distinction between salmon and trout from a language perspective. You also don't know if it's wild caught or farmed. Then you start asking some questions. Is this milk that I'm buying, is it diluted or could it be adulterated? So you have a lot of middlemen who are trying to cheat the system. This is the bad character component. Again, science is our best friend.
Yeah, John, when I'm looking at this slide here, it kind of goes back to how I used to view transparency in the supply chain, and I linked it so closely with traceability, where a lot of food and beverage executives may only think about country of origin or provenance of a product, but there's so much more that goes into this uh, topic of transparency when you're talking about the food supply chain.
Ultimately, what we want to know with all of these things is my food safe to eat? Now, software cannot tell you that. Software cannot tell you if your food is safe to eat. Here's where I make the plea at the bottom here that natural sciences really is an enabler of transparency and trust because of the objective certainty in terms of the ascertainable and verifiable characteristics of the product.
Transparency of a net chain is the extent to which all the net chain stakeholders have a shared understanding of and access to the product related information that they request without loss, without noise, without delay and distortion. I absolutely love this. And I would love for you to just break down what you have highlighted here. Who are the stakeholders? What does shared understanding mean when food executives look at this definition? What should they relate as a shared understanding? So please, John.
Yeah, well, as a lead into that, there's a lot of words that I have up here on the left-hand side about transparency being bandied around. Honesty, believability, forthrightness, sincerity, clarity, and so on. And on the right-hand side, I show a picture of an apple. Now, the reason I picked an apple because it's a very simple product. And when a consumer looks at an apple, they go, okay, this is pretty simple. It came from an orchard and probably came from the orchard in the last 3 or 4 days or the last week. But when I sit down with a particular apple producer, and this was in New Zealand, and it was with a government official at the time. And I said to the producer, I said, how transparent are you with consumers in New Zealand? And he shared with me that they're not very transparent. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, we don't tell the New Zealand consumer that these apples could have sat in a barrel for 7, 8, 9 months before they actually got into the supermarket. So my rationale back to him was, I believe that that's a story that consumers need to know. But it also has to be access to that information. So if you're talking about sharing the story of the product with consumers, how is a consumer going to access that information? One of the biggest issues that I deal with today is I work in a think tank on looking at the future digital ecosystem for Canada. It always goes back to the farmer as literally being the poor farmer, because a lot of the things that they do have not been monetized. And we need to be able to enable them to monetize what they do, whether it's organic or it's providing sustainability information up to a pool. And I suggest then that we need to enable the farmer with technology so that they can participate in multiple ecosystems. Now, let's say one of those ecosystems that they're participating in is with the producers in food and beverage. I believe there's a strong value proposition today to enable the farmer to share more information to those companies that they can add to their repertoire or to the data that they want to be transparent about, and share that information with consumers because it adds value. If we can prove that a farmer, and when I say prove, we can verify that a farmer is operating to best practices with organic, or is doing something else that's fantastic or wonderful, equal pay, and all of these other social and ethical things, if we can pass that information along with the product, then we're creating value. And that's the part where I'm very excited about, where companies can explore more aspects of transparency to create more value and ultimately give more money back to the farmers if we can monetize those data attributes. I believe that companies are missing an opportunity to monetize the fantastic work the primary producers and the secondary producers are doing in the market.
COVID-19, I mean, we must talk about this, but COVID-19, it really did create unprecedented stress on supply chains, on ecosystems. The food and beverage supply chain was no stranger to this, for sure. as consumer demand skyrocketed for retail products and the food service industry and restaurants, shut down. Many companies had to shift very quickly to get their products into different avenues of the supply chain. But I would have to think during that process of shifting to meet consumer demand, but also deal with what the food facilities around the globe were dealing with, keeping their employees safe, or perhaps shutting down because there was an outbreak at their facility. Food companies really had to shift and move very quickly. And I'm sure that things were sacrificed when it comes to transparency during that process. So as food and beverage companies have lived through this, and perhaps they're now a bit more in tune to preparing for the next crisis, what should food executives think about from the standpoint of supply chain or supply ecosystem resiliency?
I have a slide maybe I can show on that. This one here. So before I start on this, I think I want to remind your viewers of the 3Ds. And the 3Ds are, the first one is digitization. And again, words are important. Digitization is basically moving from analog to digital, period. We still have a lot of supply chains because, again, we're globalized. The bulk of the suppliers will be small, medium enterprises, again, bookended by the big guys. But digitization is not where it should be. The second D is digitalization. And digitalization is business process and role automation. We commonly, every one of us is guilty of misusing these terms, and that's not a big problem. So I'm not saying it's bad or it's good, but we have two words here that help us explain. Digitization is moving from analog to digital, but digitalization is the business process and role automation. The third D is digital transformation. Digital transformation is not really about the technology per se, it's an enabler, but digital transformation is about the journey and it's about change management. And I think we need to have those three really, really well understood within organizations. Now, if I take a step back and I was sitting down with executives, I'd say, well, first off, you need to look at your supply chain and look at those 3Ds. The very important one for a big organization is the digital transformation. But they need to look at the maturity of their supply chain. Are they providing their platform out to the companies that don't have technology today, the small farmers in Vietnam or Thailand? And are they doing some automation? Are they using things like blockchain? Are they using IoT? Are they using smart technology to be able to predict will there be a problem down the road? This slide here is from Shift. Is one of the most beautiful slides that we can imagine. It's very complex, but this really helps us think about systems thinking and what I call very often the cascading consequences of system failures. And this is very, very important. So on the left-hand side, I have a circle here. When you're looking at building resilience into your supply chain, food companies today need to be able to understand systems and ecosystems that are out there and how they're connected together. So I'll give a simple example for your listeners. I have a factory, and the factory is just a normal building, 10,000 square feet or whatever. The systems that are involved in that factory include, telephone, internet, electricity, water, and it could be more inputs. There's also then machinery, there's maintenance, there's the human resources, there's insurance, there's medical, there's food safety, and there's a myriad of ecosystems that are independent but connected to that factory. So if you put that factory in the center of this picture here, you could start to build a picture of what's around it. And then if you look at what would happen if something over here on the left-hand side failed, what would be the impact on my business? What would be the impact on my staff? So when you get into cases like COVID and where you had factories where there was outbreaks, then it becomes pretty significant. Now that again is predictable, and we did predict it. The food companies kept producing and producing and producing. Now I'm not faulting the food companies, but some of them, especially in the US, they got protection from the government because the government moved to the Defense Act. As you start to build this picture, you realize that, again, as I mentioned earlier, consumers are changing, their behavior is changing, the way they're engaging with companies is changing. What I recommend to companies is, rather than talking about farm to fork traceability, which is very narrow, enhance the conversation, make it broader, and I give them my permission to talk about farm to fork transparency. It's a broader discussion where traceability is one of the components.
Yes.
And I'm trying to get them to reframe this to a farm to fork transparency issue. And then people challenge me, they go, oh, but John, but the consumer can scan a product and find out where it came from. I said, that's not traceability, that's traceback. That's a traceback. Right. The retailer doesn't know who bought the product in most cases, right? So I'm clarifying the definitions of traceability and what does traceability mean. The consumer can query a product and look at the traceability, but also the transparency, the story. And this is the beautiful part of all of this, is when we start thinking and talking and reframing the conversation from traceability to transparency, and then I think we'll start making more progress when we do that.
Absolutely. I mean, this slide, it's just so eye-opening to how interconnected we all are. And when food and beverage companies take a look at a slide like this, John, and they want to take the next step in preparing for the next hiccup, the next outbreak, the next contamination situation, the next plant closure, I have always appreciated how you talk about creating tripwires, circuit breakers. Can you bring us through, I believe you have a slide on this. Can
yes,
you
absolutely.
bring us through your thought process on this?
Absolutely.
I really like how you illustrate this point.
So just to close on this one, the point here is to look at multiple ecosystems and how they connect together. And I recommend food companies in particular not to forget the role of the government in defining regulation and also what's permitted and what's not permitted, and the key and crucial role that they have in all of this. So when you look at the supply chain and resilience, I build on this with Carl Eunice. We looked at McDonald and Corsi and their supply chain disruption model. So this model talks about your system is performing, you do your risk management, and then something happens, and then you're managing what they call a disruption. But the key component here is the discovery. When did you discover the problem? And it's only when you discover it that you can start to do the recovery, and then you can start doing the redesign of it. I believe that you can, I use this term technology tripwires, where the technology can provide you with that advance warning for something that may happen or is about to happen or is trending to happen. And my argument here is that if you discover it after it's happened, it's way too late. We need to be more predictive. And the circuit breaker is where it's like the GPS saying, turn left here, get off the highway right now. This is a course correction. And this circuit breaker, I'm happy to see that governments are now using this circuit breaker as a term in their COVID response, where the circuit breaker is like a lockdown, or a circuit breaker could be, mask usage or so on. So the notion of technology tripwires and circuit breakers, we build on this paper we have around rethinking future food chains that was featured in the June-July version of one of the food safety magazines. And I think that this is where organizations need to get to. And I'll elaborate on why this is important. So if you look at this model here, these are examples again from McDonald and Corsi. If you look at item number D halfway down the page, and you look at, did they have a plan? And it's yes. Did they use the plan? Partially. Did they rehearse it? Unknown. The discovery took weeks. The recovery took months. And it cost them $100 million. Now, this was a product quality failure. So it's very, very hard on a company to be able to recover from this. And especially, again, depending on the actual product itself, it may have caused harm to a consumer. or it may have failed in a product like a car, and it may have caused accidents and injury, and there may be massive liability even outside of what you see here.
I love this slide, John, because I spend a lot of my time with my clients identifying risks and then quantifying those risks.
Exactly.
Because I think once you quantify a risk and you see that it can cost a company $100 million, you know that that company is going to take action. Okay, here is why we need to do something about this. And you start, for instance, in the food and beverage industry, of course, everyone is fearful of a recall scenario and the brand damage that can result from a recall scenario. And companies will go through mock recall drills. In many cases, I find them to be simply traceability exercises. You need to go a bit further than traceability, and really, go into communication strategies. What are you going to say to your consumer if you're faced with a food safety situation? So this slide is so important, and I'm really happy that you're sharing this with the audience today, because I think it's important for companies to look at all of these different scenarios and put a number on it, right? And start building those tripwires so you can identify these things that may be in process and catch them early.
Exactly.
So John, look, you have just provided so much valuable information here, and I'm going to put you on the spot one more time and ask you if you could just maybe provide some closing comments for our listeners to act on. I turn the floor to you, and sorry to put this this pressure on you, but you seem to be good on the spot. So what do you have for us?
Again, depending on who we're talking to, if it's the CEO, I would say fix the data when you're in your company. Fix the data. And in fixing the data, you really need to embrace GS1 standards, and most companies, in fact all companies are, but they need to drive it down across departments. If I'm talking to someone in marketing at a large company, they more than likely will have no clue who GS1 is. So I think it's very important that a broader audience within these food companies and beverage companies, a broader audience knows about the investment these companies are making in GS1 standards, and focus on getting the data right. The second thing I would say is explore opportunities where you can either hire a veteran who's trained in resilience or in systems thinking, or look for executive leadership training at various levels in your organization where you can train your staff on systems thinking. And again, hire a veteran is a great thing to do, or someone that has that background, because that's what they do very, very well. Strategy comes from the military, but also execution and a focus, and myopic focus on sharp execution, taking in all of the different risks is very important. In the US and in Canada, we have employed military generals to look at our vaccine supply chains, and it's for a reason. It's because when you get into a crisis, you need that command and control expertise, and you need a very sharp focus on execution and getting it done. So systems thinking, get the data right, and I would say look at your supply chain end to end, but focus on the ecosystem rather than just the linear supply chain of products. I would guarantee companies, if they start thinking in terms of systems, it will make it easier for them to understand the ecosystems that they're connected to. And if they understand those ecosystems, they can do better risk management, because they can look at what would happen if this ecosystem over here failed. And this is what I call the cascading consequences of system failures. It's not hard to do, but there's just a couple of small things that companies need to get right. The last thing I would say is the 3 Ds: digitization, digitalization, and digital transformation. You need to have a solid understanding that they are different, and we can't make an assumption that all of our supply chain, even in Canada and the US, we still have faith-based groups that are not digitized. So we need to figure out how we can embrace them into our local, regional, and national or North American supply chains within that context that they shun technology, but they're still invaluable contributors to our local economy and to the nutrition of the nation. So the assumption is that everyone is digitized. That's not the case.
John, thank you so much. I sincerely I appreciate your time and your expertise. The information that you have shared is invaluable to all of our listeners. And I would encourage anyone who watches this web series to follow John. He's easy to find. He has a great presence online. You can find him on LinkedIn. You can find him on YouTube, a lot of YouTube videos. John, I know you are launching this new series. What is the name of the series? It's all about food traceability or transparency, correct? Tell us a little bit more about that.
2 years ago, I launched a series called The Future of Food, and last year did a significant amount of interviews. I call it 10 by 10. So I'll talk with 10 executives or 10 subject matter experts for 10 minutes. So that's the format of that Future of Food 10 by 10. So if on the website, there's, I talked with executives at different levels. I talked with academics. And last year, just before Christmas, I did a 10 by 10 with blockchain solution providers, which may be very valuable for companies to have a look at. So that's 10 times 10 minutes with 10 companies. And then after that, I concluded with an academic panel with 4 professors. In fact, there was 3 in the end, 3 professors. And we talked about what they saw, what they heard, and what the gaps are. And how do we look at the academic side of this? What can we do better in academia to do research? And how can we help? This latest series is now a Future of Food mini-series on food provenance. Again, it's intended to help educate on what food provenance is, to talk about why would we do it, what are the benefits, what is the technology that we use, what are the challenges, and so on. So I've spoken with 8 different scientists, and we published that. There's a few more scientists that want to be included, and I may do a few more interviews on that in the next week. As we go through the year, I'll do a multitude of 10 by 10s. They will include traceability, recall, anti-counterfeit, halal, and also one that's that we're supposed to launch in the first quarter is on predictive analytics. So the future of food, predictive analytics, where we'll talk with food companies, beverage companies, academics, technology firms about what does this mean, predictive analytics? How do we use AI? How do we use machine learning to help us manage the food chains much better?
Well, John, I will be following all of that content, and I'm sure our listeners will be tuning in as well. I also want to thank you for being so gracious. Allow me to explain. Here on Food for Thought, we typically give a gift to our guests. After learning that you are a vegan, I reached out to one of my food clients, great vegan company by the name of No Evil Foods. I reached back out to you to get a shipping address, and I think it's then you realize what we were up to here at Foe & Son, and you stopped us. And you graciously said, please donate that food product to a food bank. So in your honor, instead of sending you No Evil Food products, we worked with No Evil Foods to help them continue the amazing work that they are doing in their local community with a charity called Bounty and Soul. They're out of Black Mountain, North Carolina. So we will end this episode today, the first Food for Thought of 2021, with a very uplifting message from one of the co-founders of No Evil Foods. So John, thank you. Happy New Year. And to all of our listeners, Happy New Year to you as well. And please stay tuned for the live Q&A.
My pleasure. Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and best of luck for 2021.
Hi, I'm Sadra Shadell, co-founder of No Evil Foods. Our mission at No Evil Foods is to fuel and inspire positive change on people, the planet, and animals through awesome plant-based food. Our company takes as many opportunities as we can to put more good into the world, and we believe that when you give, we also receive. One of the organizations that we love to support is called Bounty and Soul. They're a local community-based nonprofit that provides access to fresh plant-based food through their weekly no-cost farmers markets. In 2020, with the help of Bounty and Soul, No Evil Foods distributed over 12,000 pounds of plant meat, which equates to about 64,000 servings of healthy plant-based proteins. We and Bounty and Soul believe in creating communities where everyone has the right and the opportunity to eat well, be nourished, and thrive. And I was so touched when Michael shared John's request to make a donation on behalf of No Evil Foods to Bounty and Soul. I think that is the perfect illustration of how we can all work to do no evil and add a little more good into the world every day.
Thanks to everyone for joining us here on Food for Thought. My deep appreciation goes to John Keogh for being our guest today, and to the team at No Evil Foods and Bounty and Soul. Thank you for allowing us to play a small part in the positive change that you're bringing to your local community. To continue the conversation on transparency in the food and beverage ecosystem, please reach out to me at any time. I look forward to hearing from you. And as always, I'd like to close by thanking all of our FOA and Son valued clients for allowing us to serve your risk management and insurance needs. It's our honor to play a role in your food and beverage journey and your success. I'll see you next time on Food for Thought. Welcome back, everyone, to the live Q&A. John, if you're going to join us, the time is now. There you are.
I was wondering if we had to wear the same clothes as in the video.
Well, you know, that we'll think about that for future episodes. That's a good point. Keep it seamless, right? So, Patty, I know that you've been monitoring the various chat avenues. Do we have any questions that have come in from the listeners?
We do. So the first question, and the person's anonymous, so I don't know from who, but what is your opinion on major risks to the food chain where more transparency or use of technology could minimize that risk?
For me, Michael?
You know what, John, I think we can both take a stab. I mean, I have my thoughts on this as well. You know, maybe I'll touch on it briefly, but what I've seen more and more, and in fact, John, you just today, you put a quote, you put a post up on LinkedIn about this. One of the big concerns that I have in the food supply chain right now, especially with the breakdown of systems that can take place in a pandemic type situation we find ourselves in, where you have companies shifting, is food fraud. That's something I'm looking at very closely. And when I talk about food fraud, I am talking about economic adulteration. I'm talking about, you know, to bring this to life, let's think about an importer who's bringing in spices or cumin, to be exact. We have seen in the past cumin has been adulterated by the introduction of a lesser cost product, which is peanut protein. So again, you know, I think this is where transparency in the supply chain can really help curb those situations, you know, where, you know, instead of just relying on a certificate of analysis from a foreign producer, perhaps dig a little bit deeper, do your own testing, more surveillance. So yes, food fraud is on the top of my list. And again, you find this in multiple areas of the food supply chain, not just spices. You can find it with oils. You know, think about olive oil. 100% olive oil that may be tainted with some other lesser cost oils. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, if I reflect on what happened, what is happening and still happens with sustainability, you have this term we call greenwashing. Well, we have another term that some folks talk about, and it's called blockchain washing. So in other words, firms that may say that, oh, we have a blockchain, so we are transparent and you can trust us. That's not always the case, because again, as I talked about in the video, food trust is two main enemies: bad character and bad data. So we have to watch out and we have to manage for that. If I'm talking to executives around transparency, they want to be more transparent in their supply chain, I tell them they have to be prepared for the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there will be a component of all three of those, hopefully more towards the good side. Some firms may be less risk averse, and they go, you know what, if we tell our consumers that we actually buy from this location or country, we may be guilty by association because there's a lot of reports of, slavery, child labor, deforestation, and so on. But on the other hand, their marketing executives are saying, well, if we're not transparent, we're kind of guilty by omission. So they have to get that balance. And when they get on that journey for transparency, they have to be prepared for the good, the bad, and the ugly. And let me share with you and with the listeners what used to happen. So when the big NGOs out there like Greenpeace would provide evidence to a food firm, let's say 5 years ago, that they found deforestation or habitat loss or slavery or child labor, in a lot of cases, these big companies would employ their crisis management strategy. And crisis management, I talked in the video about a 3D model. A crisis management is normally the 4 or 5D model. And guess what the first D is, Michael? Deny. Deny. What is this? What is the second D? Discredit. The third D, defer or delay. And there's a whole bunch of D's that are in there. We joke about this, but it's serious business. In crisis management, you deny, you discredit. And this was the traditional way of approaching this. These days, we have companies like Nestle who are embracing this change, embracing transparency. They understand that we have the good, the bad, and the ugly. And nowadays, I think companies like Nestle are showing leadership where they will sit down with these NGOs if they have evidence, and they'll work through that, and they'll admit that they have to tighten up. And I'm using Nestle as an example of positive change, that other companies could look at that example and say, you know what, that's the right thing to do.
You know what, John, I've been trying to just memorize the 3 Ds that you talked about during our pre-recorded discussion. And now you're giving me more Ds that I have to memorize. So
there's many Ds out there.
Patty, any other questions that came through?
Yeah, we have a question from our own Bradley Hamburger, actually. What do you believe are the biggest threats to food safety with all the current delays in the food chain?
You were a little bit low on that. Could you say it again, please?
Sure. What do you believe are the biggest threats to food safety with the current delays in the food chain?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to what I said previously, that ties right into food safety, because it's not just about the economic adulteration, bringing in lesser, value products in exchange for what the consumer perceives to be a higher value product or a higher quality product. But when you're substituting, when a bad actor, as John talks about, there are bad actors out there, when they are substituting peanut protein, for instance, in exchange for cumin, you're now introducing an allergen, right? So that can lead to massive recalls, huge food safety exposures, obviously. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And, even pre-COVID, we have evidence from the UK from 2017, which suggested that among the survey population of 200 food and beverage companies, that 32% of them said, and this is shocking, 32% of them said that because of the pressure from retailers to drive the prices down, they've had to cut costs. And because of that, 32% said they could not guarantee the authenticity of the products. So food, then you're talking about food quality and food safety are impacted. So what I often say, Michael, is that companies today are playing Russian roulette with consumer health and safety. So there are things that are happening right now that should be what's called never events. We should not be having undeclared allergens in products. We unfortunately, we have companies who are now developing tests to see if there's animal DNA in plant-based milks. We shouldn't be doing that. And vice versa, we have the same company is developing tests to find plant-based DNA in animal milk. We shouldn't be doing that. So we see these recalls coming out, 2 major ones coming out of Canada. Today it's what I call it, and I'm not a consultant, I'm an advisor. In other words, I say things very direct. I'm not going to say things just to pacify a client or an audience. I'll tell it direct, but based on evidence. And based on the evidence that we have, certain food companies that are having these recalls, especially with allergens, are playing Russian roulette, and they're demonstrating to the market that they don't have the proper governance frameworks in place and competence frameworks in place. So the food safety management protocols that are in place today are failing.
You know, John, and obviously, you know, you and I have talked about this, but all of those recall notices, they tend to be released on Friday afternoon.
Yep.
Right?
4 and 5.
You know, but the other point I want to make, you know, you mentioned that these allergen recalls, they should not be taking place.
Yep.
But again, as long as the bad actors exist in the food ecosystem, you know, and I'm not quite sure how we eliminate the bad actors from the food ecosystem. Don't you believe that companies need to develop these tests, unfortunately, these DNA tests, to perform that further analysis, that further surveillance to make sure that their products are safe before they enter the stream of commerce?
Absolutely, and let me pick on one. And I know there may be someone from Subway on your audience or listening to this afterwards. But let me just outline this. So before Christmas in Ireland, the courts ruled that Subway's bread is not actually bread. It's confectionery because they had more than 2% sugar. The company should know that, right? So the implications for Subway, now it's not an unsafe product, it's not classified as bread because it's got more than 2% sugar, which means it's taxed differently in the legal system. So it took a legal case to identify that. The food safety regulator, or the food regulator, didn't spot that. It came from the legal challenge. In Canada in 2017, we had Subway were challenged, again, because of an investigative report. They found, allegedly, 50% of soy in the chicken. Now, they challenged that in court and they lost. So, and that analysis was done at Guelph University, our top agri-food science laboratory in Canada. So there's evidence is building up, and now we're having something, again, it's an allegation not proven in court, but we're having more allegations for Subway around their tuna. And these are things that these companies need to take serious. I don't think that there's a mass conspiracy out there against Subway, and I wish them well in dealing with this. But food companies need to be transparent about what they're putting into their food. If you are putting in 2% soy, well then tell the consumers that you're putting in 2% soy. If it has X amount of sugar, then tell the consumer it has that. So I think it's not only the bad actors. I'm seeing more and more that we're discovering that the good actors actually have bad habits. I'll put it that way. I don't think that any of the companies out there want to make people sick or poison them. I think they're all well intended, but the more popular that our science is getting, and our science is actually developing faster than industry's ability to prevent the problems, if that makes sense. So in other words, we can detect lower and lower components of a contamination in a product.
Sure, and also just the litigious society we find ourselves in today, John, especially in North America. It provides a little more incentive. Not that companies should need incentive to do the right thing, but it does provide that nudge towards true transparency, because you are welcoming a lawsuit, similar to what we're seeing with Subway right now. Exactly.
And again, I know Subway will come out of this fine, and it's a great company, and they have some great people in there. They have great supply chains, and in fact, they're one of my case studies in supply chain where I celebrate some of the work that they're doing with GS1 on the effective traceability. But again, Subway is a big system. They have a lot of suppliers. They have also the local component, and I was dealing with a case a few days ago where a British exporter who lives in Vietnam, and he was telling me that he got some fruits. He was shipping them to a major retailer somewhere in the Western hemisphere, and he got them tested by a laboratory with a global brand name on the outside. Global brand name on the outside, well-known laboratory. They tested the products based on the import requirements in that country, the target market, and also for that customer. And when it got to Europe, In this case, I've exposed it now, it's Europe. But when it got there, it actually failed. It had 10 or 15 or 20 times, actually, I think he said it had 100 times more pesticide residue than was permitted. That cost him, as a small operator, $30,000 because it was rejected. So he had containers and containers and containers in Europe. What does he do? Does he dump them somewhere? Does he call the Port of Amsterdam saying, where can I dump these vegetables that are fruits that my customer won't accept? So again, we have these global brands who carry a lot of credibility, but locally you still have the local culture. And this is part of the issue that I try to get through to some of these bigger companies that don't trust the brand. Get the evidence. And if you're relying on a global brand that has an operation in countries like Thailand or Vietnam or China, or it doesn't matter where they are, you need to do a secondary check. Like those 200 companies in the UK in food and beverage, 32% of them cannot verify that the products are authentic. We need more checks and balances in there. This is why I'm doing this session on product provenance, because it's so important. Provenance will not only tell you which product it is, but also where it came from, and if it has certain trace elements in that product. So you're not only verifying the provenance, you're also verifying the authenticity of the product.
Well, Brad Hamburger, who's a big part of our food and beverage team here at Foe & Son, thank you for that question. It spurred on some great discussion there. Patty, any other questions that we have?
There's one more question. I just want you guys to know we have about 7 more minutes. So the question is about larger buyers like Walmarts of the world. And, when it comes to what will they require of their vendors from a transparency perspective?
Right. I think John is well positioned to talk about this. I mean, I hear from my clients in the food and beverage supply chain who sell to those customers that the squeeze is on. These larger retailers, they are making more demands upon their vendors. They want the high quality, they want the transparency, they want the technology, but the vendors are still working from very thin profit margins. So you're seeing companies who have to make some pretty important business decisions as to whether to continue down that path with that customer, because can they do everything that they're being asked to do? And maybe the vendor wants to do all these things. They want to bring transparency to the consumer, but there's a cost associated with that, and there's a value to that, right? So can these bigger retailers take on that expense? There's a lot of pressure right now to meet these demands. There's a lot of stress. John, are you finding the same with the food companies you're talking to?
Yes. Well, first off, I think large organizations like Walmart have done more to develop food safety practices in developing countries than their governments have done. And so fair play to what Walmart and other companies have done, especially in Asia, but not exclusively. So they bring a significant amount of value, and they wield more power to drive safer supply chains than regulatory authorities have in some nations. Now, the pressure again is different. If you're in the US and you want to sell to Walmart, that's fantastic. And companies should be able to comply. But there is a lot of price pressure. If it's fruit and vegetables or leafy greens, then you're following the PTI initiative, which is about 7 attributes that you have to share. I think one mistake that Walmart made is trying to, I'm going to use this word, trying to force everyone to use the IBM Food Trust. I don't think that's a good approach. We've seen mandates before, like the RFID mandate from Walmart, and typically you're going to have vendors reject that. If you look at the PTI initiative, the Produce Traceability Initiative, all the parties, all the stakeholders agreed to do this, get 7 attributes and share them. But last year, one of the main associations announced that even after a dozen years, they've only about 60% adoption of that. So we got to figure out why has only 60% of companies adopted that. Is it because of the cost? And we know that when you get down into the smaller tiers of suppliers, it is a big significant issue when you get into the cost. When you get into Asian countries, the problems are different again. Even if Walmart believes that their suppliers are doing everything that they want, it's impossible for Walmart and their agents to monitor these supply chains. So it's very, very difficult. Walmart has a very difficult challenge because of what we call the unobservability of the supply chains and everything that they're doing. So the risk of opportunism, quality cheating, and social norm cheating, let's say using children, those risks are still there. So while the Walmarts are very good at very powerful, even the Walmarts of the world still have risks in their supply chain that they have to deal with, and they know how to do it. They know how to do that very well.
Patty, any other questions? I know we're short on time here, so we want to leave enough time to select our winners of the No Evil Foods product as well.
Yeah, that is the extent of the question, and it's perfect time to pick our winners. So, and you don't have to be present to win, which is great. Our first winner I picked out of our virtual hat is Debbie San from Moment Magazine. We will be getting Debbie some wonderful No Evil vegan foods. And the other winner is David Triglia from AMD Oil Sales. And we will be in touch with both of you to get your physical address to send you some treats.
All right, and thank you to No Evil Foods for your participation and helping us out with this episode. John, thank you so much. Your involvement here is it was really fantastic to have you on. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you for teaching me to think about all of this differently. I'll continue to follow your content and continue to be challenged by your teaching. So I appreciate you.
We learned from each other, Michael, and thank you, Patty and Sandra as well for the opportunity to talk to your audience. We learned from each other, but before I go, I do want to reach out and just say thank you to all of those who are out there in the front line, whether it's in healthcare or in the food industry, that are helping to bring food to us today and in everything you do. I know there's also the drivers that are out there, not just in the food factories, but there's a lot of people working really hard and putting their lives on the line to help us. So thank you to all of those people who do that.
Yes, that is a wonderful way to end this episode. Thank you for that, John. Much appreciated. Thank you all, and we will catch you next time on Food for Thought. Take care.